This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by supporters like you. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the efforts here at Trifles. Just go to patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 270. The missing three-quarter, one-third discovered. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we bring you the details of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to be fractionally discovered?
Oh, yeah, I'm ready to be drawn and quartered. I'm ready for anything.
Drawn and quartered. Well, as long as you're not decimated, I think that's fine. And those are about all the math puns I can squeeze out at this divisive period.
I don't worry about decimation. I worry about matriculation.
Well, please, keep that to yourself. This is episode 270, and the show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles270, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to the Sherlock Holmes Podcast.com website, where you can find links related to this episode, as well as how to support us on Patreon. We just had a drawing in the last episode, our monthly drawing, for all of our Patreon supporters. And if you are a supporter for as little as $1 a month up to $10 a month, then your name goes in the pot for this regular drawing. We also do a quarterly drawing for a free subscription to the Baker Street Journal, courtesy of our sponsors. So, if you would like to get in touch with us for any reason, of course, the email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com, or you can pick up your phone, give us a call. You can record an MP3 and attach it as an email, send it to that email address, or call us at 5-1895-221-B-5. Well, it is the first week in the month, and that means it is time for our traditional Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist, where we take an old piece of Sherlockian scholarship and walk you through it. In this case, we have turned to the Baker Street Journal, the old series, Volume 2, Number 2, from 1947, and we're looking at an article called Missing Three-Quarter, One-Third Discovered by Henry D. Scott. Bert, what do we know about, well, I don't know if we know anything about this author, do we? That Henry Scott is not a familiar name to me.
Oh, no, neither is he a familiar name to me. But it's wonderful because we've gone back to Volume 2, Number 1 of the old series, the first series of the Baker Street Journal, when everything was new. And the whole great game of new Sherlockian scholarship in the 1940s. And boy, how John Lellenberg, our old friend John Lellenberg, loved this period of time. Everything was new. And there were so many interesting things to write about and so many opportunities to find something you were interested in and then connect it, sometimes a little distantly, but connected nonetheless, to Sherlock Holmes. So it's a bit of a time machine, this, and it's a lot of fun.
It is. And what I love about this one is, I don't want to go too much inside baseball here, Well, seeing the sports are on the mind, as we're recording, the Major League Baseball just announced that it is doing away with opening day. It's going to be missing opening day because of protracted negotiations among the player union, unfortunately. So, as we look through this issue, by the way, I think I said this was issue of volume 2, number 2. It's volume 2, number 1. Excuse me, from 1940. But as we look through this one, missing 3/4. Okay, that's one of the stories. It involves sports. 1/3 discovered. Well, Henry Scott, as part of his opening here, mentions that he is Yale class of 1914. Now, during the BSI weekend, when Sherlockians regularly gather in New York City in January, we often stay at the Yale Club, and there are photos. If you stay up in the rooms up at the Yale Club, there are old photos of the early 1900s, and many of them are sports teams. And I can just imagine that Henry D. Scott might be someone in one of these pictures as we're roaming the halls of the Yale Club. But he says, adventures and misadventures aplenty, both canonical and apocryphal, have befallen our hero. But I think I can report one more that'll be novel to most of his admirers. How many of you would suspect that Sherlock Holmes was once a member of a football team? And he says, I don't mean rugby or soccer either, but United States football as currently demonstrated by Army, Minnesota, and the Green Bay Packers. Furthermore, the 11 of which he was a member could have wiped up the gridiron with any other team that ever wore cleats. Now, it should be added, I admit, that this team never played a game. It was, as a matter of fact, an imaginary team. But still, it was a football team, and Sherlock Holmes made it.
Now, isn't that wonderful? Because, today we have many fantasy sports teams of different sizes that are presented as groups, and many people participate in this. But here we are in 1947 with Henry D. Scott, an imaginary team, and Sherlock Holmes made it. He tells us the circumstances. As you said, he points out that he was part of the class that graduated in 1914. The class did, he says, but I didn't. But that's another story, he says. But this is, right before World War I. And he talks a little bit about, the future at the time seeming predictable and secure. We were a carefree group of boys. Every spring, a baseball game was played between teams representing the faculty at Yale and the Phi Beta Kappa Society. And it would be impossible to collect 18 more spavined and butterfingered parodies on ball players than that game produced. And he tells you, a little bit about that. Well, he says, somewhere along the line, somebody suggested to Billy Phelps that he pick an all-time, all-literary football team, because then football was something of a religion, and Yale was its sanctuary, and Walter Camp its prophet.
Now, this is interesting because he throws around the name Billy Phelps. And, to modern or his contemporary readers in 1947, I think they would have recognized the name Billy Phelps. But to a latter-day scholar like yourself or like me, and I use scholar very lightly when it comes to me, the name Billy Phelps really brings nothing to mind. How about you?
Oh, yeah, he was a cousin of Percy Phelps. I thought everybody knew that.
Oh, so it was Holmes that was whacking him across the shins with a baseball bat rather than a cricket bat.
Yeah.
Well, no, in this case, this is William Lyon Phelps, who lived from 1865 to 1943 in New Haven, Connecticut, hence the connection to Yale. He was an American author, critic, and scholar, and he taught the first American university course on the modern novel. And he also, this is interesting, he also had a radio show, wrote a daily syndicated newspaper column, lectured frequently, and published numerous books and articles.
Well, how interesting.
He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Yale in 1887, writing an honors thesis on the idealism of George Berkeley. Got his PhD from Yale the same year as well. In 1891. In the same year, he got his AM from Harvard. And then he was offered a position in the English department at Yale, which is where Henry D. Scott of the Baker Street Journal must have known him. Phelps was very athletic and played what was then the new game of baseball, as well as golf and lawn tennis. And he studied novelists like Leo Tolstoy and Ivan Turgenev.
Well, the lovely thing about this, among the many lovely things, is that he set down some rules for this imaginary team. And one of his rules was that only one man from any one literary source would be eligible. Otherwise, you could fill up your line with heroes from the Iliad or put the Three Musketeers in the backfield and so on and have your team right there. So just one person from every literary source. And Billy came up with this team, the Ends. Now, we're talking about football. Ends, Hiawatha and Robin Hood. Tackles, Sir Lancelot and Paul Bunyan.
Oh, don't mess with them.
Guards, Porthos and John Ridd. Now, I don't know who John Ridd was.
John Ridd.
Center, Jean Valjean.
John Ridd is from Lorna Doone.
Oh, the cookie. I remember that.
Yeah, the son of the respectable, the son of the respectable farmer in 17th century Exmoor.
Oh, well, that gets us to Jean Valjean, who's still carrying around that loaf of bread, which he really should have left alone. And the quarterback, of course, Sherlock Holmes.
How about that?
The halfbacks, Achilles and Frank Merriwell.
Well,
and the fullback, Samson.
Well, see, the problem with this is Achilles was immediately on the disabled list because he, of course, tore his Achilles tendon. What incredible lack of foresight on Billy Phelps's part. Well, we're going to come back and talk about this fantasy football league involving Sherlock Holmes right after this quick word. Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today. All right, we're back after the Pepsi halftime show there. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll land Pepsi as a sponsor anytime soon. Do you?
No.
Well, this is more of a Coke show with Sherlock Holmes at the center of it. So, what can we say? I want to add one more aside about Billy Phelps, our inveterate list maker here. During his time as a Yale professor, according to his Wikipedia page, Phelps invited a number of the senior class's notable students together in 1884 and founded the Pundits. They dined weekly at Maury's, a private club adjacent to the campus. They regularly lampooned the campus with elaborate pranks, and among the notable members of the Pundits was composer Cole Porter. So it stands to reason that Billy Phelps would come up with this kind of fun fantasy league of literary players.
It's wonderful. And Scott tells us here, Henry Scott tells us that it reminds us that at this time, the game of football, was a little different. I mean, the equipment, the rules, the conduct. He says at this time, football was just emerging from the old bone-crushing 5 yards for first down era and was still largely an affair of mass power. The quarterback rarely carried the ball, but was primarily a strategist and a field general. He believes the choice for this position lay among Sherlock Holmes, D'Artagnan, and the wily Ulysses. But Porthos and Achilles could not be kept off the team, and the one-man rule cleared the field for Holmes. Some might argue that Sherlock's habits were not conducive to the best condition, and that his physique was ill-adapted to a sport involving violent personal contact. But we have it on the best authority that he was always in training.
Yeah, he was exceptionally fast on his feet, probably a 10-second man. And he didn't outstrip the self-admittedly fleet Watson and practically overtake the galloping hound. Remember that? He bested the offensive Woodley in a fair fight. That would be in the solitary cyclist. And he was strong enough to bend or at least straighten a cold iron poker with his bare hands in the speckled band.
Yes, a man who could transfix, or almost transfix, a dead pig with a harpoon could surely launch a useful forward pass. And we know that he feinted one determined tackler out of position and into the Reichenbach fall.
Yeah, and Scott writes, I think that Holmes would have taken as good care of himself on the gridiron as did Albie Booth. Now, Booth weighed about 135 pounds and looked like the team's mascot or some school kid on the field by mistake. When his diminutive figure appeared into a swarm of 200-pounders, you instinctively shuddered and looked around for the stretcher bearers. About that time, Albie would emerge from the pileup, minus his headgear and most of his jersey, but still traveling goalward with the ball. And, of course, Holmes's chief value would be in strategy and diagnosing the opposition's formations. After the first 10 minutes, he would have decoded their signals and could call every enemy play, if the enemy ever got the ball.
It's just a lovely picture, isn't it? He says that the vision of that lean, muscular figure taking a lateral from the wrathful Achilles and tearing downfield, protected by the vigorous blocking of Sir Lancelot and Hiawatha. Well, it has at least the merit of novelty.
It does indeed. And, I would invite our listeners, if you think this was a fun exercise for Henry D. Scott to put together, or for Billy Phelps to put together, why don't we engage in a little exercise of our own? Let's choose an 11-person team from within the canon, from within the Sherlock Holmes stories. Who would you put on that team? Who would you make the quarterback? Who would you make the tackles and the guards? Why don't you send us your best idea for your fantasy football team made up of Sherlock Holmes characters at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We'd be delighted to hear from you.
And me, I'm really just standing next to the tea trolley with Mrs. Hudson, but that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
This incident gives zest to our investigation.